Welcome to, thank you. Welcome everybody to the Journal-isms Roundtable, including those on Facebook. We want to give a special shout out to them. And to those who are going to be watching this later on YouTube or on Facebook. The Journal-isms Roundtable is, my name is Richard Prince, and I write a column called Journal-isms, Journal-isms, which is at journal-isms.com, and it is about diversity issues in the news business. And this is an extension of that in a way. We can have more of a deep dive into certain topics when we have a bunch of smart people in the room, such as yourselves, talking about it. So today the topic is going to be what journalists ought to know about, or need to know about Africa. And we have some really cogently people who can articulate on that topic very cogently. The Journal-isms Roundtable started in 1999 when a bunch of friends, fellow journalists, bid farewell to a colleague of ours who was going to get a doctorate in California. And she said, keep this going while I'm away. And we did. That was 1999. And we met in various restaurants around Washington, D.C. until COVID hit in 2020, when we switched to Zoom, which enabled us to have a much bigger audience because people can come all around the world. I see Emmanuel and Doug Beebe is there from West Africa. That's good. Glad to see him, which we couldn't have done, of course, if we were just people who were able to get to the restaurant. And next month, we hope to move the roundtable, I'm going to try this now, knocking on wood, to American University.
No, we're not.
We're not?
No, John said, no, we're not.
Oh, okay. Well, I misspoke that. I thought we were going there in January. Well, let's just say that in the next few months, we're going to be there. And we will be able to have a hybrid version of this roundtable, which means that we will have people in person as well as who can participate via Zoom. So that having been said, welcome everybody once again. I think that we want to get right to the subject, and the lead person so far has been Melvin Foote, who was there at the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, and the first person we contacted when John Yearwood and I started talking about this. Melvin is the founder of the Constituency for Africa, and Joe Davidson was also on this call. Just quoted him in his roundup of what took place last week. So I want all the people who are panelists to just give us 3 minutes on answering the question, what do journalists need to know about Africa? So Melvin, you are first.
Great. Good morning, everybody. By the way, Adam, I was at the forum over at George Washington. It was fantastic. Let me say it's a great honor being here. I'm excited. You know, I've been meeting all last week. My mouth is sore because of the U.S. Africa Summit. And so what I want to say is, you know, when Richard told me what do Black journalists need to know about Africa, I said, do we have a year? Do we have a year? Do we have $1 million budget? So
right.
Do seminars in Africa and that's what we really need to do. So you guys need to put a grant together for sure, because we have to go beyond the rhetoric. I will say that the summit itself, it was great. It was fantastic. On a scale of 10, I give it about a 9.5. You know, so that's pretty good. It was better than the 2014 even. I gave this idea to President Obama when he was president in 2008. He sent a guy to me and asked me what did I think he could do since the economy was in bad shape, and he welcome to the White House, Mr. Black Man. And so I wrote a paper and I said, one of the things I should do, don't spend your time chasing Mugabe and Biya and Bashir, those old guys, spend your time with the young ones coming up. That became Yali. I said, do a White House conference on Africa. That don't cost a lot of money. And we were thinking about 4 presidents going to be the coordinators. I was thinking right in the White House. But because of the oil spill in the Gulf, that the summit got pushed to the second term, and it shifted toward trade. It still was fantastic, and I'm really excited about it. So I was happy that Biden picked it up. I can say for the first time in history, Black folks have impacted the U.S. policy on Africa. And we got to Biden very early, September 2021. We met with the director for Africa, the vice president's office, and we followed that up with a series of recommendations to the administration about their Africa policy. And so when I saw the former policy being unveiled, happy camper, all this discussion about Diaspora Day, that's us, all this discussion about youth, us, and all the discussion about diaspora trade and all. So the Biden administration took a lot of the recommendation we gave them. So we as African Americans in support of Africa are happy campers. Now it wasn't 100%. I would say the weakness of the summit was the Africans themselves. They came to the conference, each one of them on their own airplane. They didn't meet before they got here. Where is the Africa Union on this? They didn't meet before they came here. So Gambia come to Gambia, come to Burundi. When they were supposed to come here, they were supposed to have met in advance and agree on 4 things they wanted from Biden. 4 things. So you come to Washington, Mr. Biden, we want 4 things from the United States. Now, of course, these are billion-dollar things, but they didn't do that. They didn't even consult the diaspora. We're supposed to be the 6th region. In 2012, we were in South Africa. They had a big whoopla talking about the diaspora as the 6th region of Africa. They didn't think it was prudent to even call the diaspora and say, what do you think we could get out of these guys? So the weakness in my mind was the lack of organization coming from Africa. I was told that no more than 20 of them were going to come to the summit. They weren't happy with the United States. They didn't want us to lecture them. They wanted to go to Doha for the football game. They didn't want to come to Washington. I was told all these kind of things. So I was told not more than 20 are going to be here. 49 were here, and they came with all of their ministers. Many of them are still here. They're still shopping. They're all in the malls and whatnot buying stuff for the holidays. I don't mean to be moaned by. Yesterday, I had breakfast with Kwame Nkrumah's son, and we had a real discussion about this summit and about the follow-up and how we harmonize the relationship between Africa and the diaspora. So I'm a happy camper. There's a lot of work ahead. They announced they're going to do a diaspora advisory council. Wow. That's another thing we had recommended. Now they said there's going to be 12 people. I'm being lobbied left and right because everybody thinks I got pull on that. I don't have any pull on that, but I'm telling them it can't be led by a U.S. government official as they did with the National Summit on Africa a few years ago. I think that's my 3 minutes. But I'm just saying I'm excited here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think it's long overdue. You guys have a tremendous role to play in all this. Not only the summit itself, but the follow-up on the summit. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Milton. Now I wonder if Milton is here. Milton Allimadi.
Yes.
You are,
yes,
Milton. Okay. Well, tell us. I was before you arrived. I was telling people about your message about what's wrong with Africa, or the African leaders more specifically. And I was saying that when I bounced it off a number of people, some of whom are on this call, or actually all of them are on the call, they all agreed with you. So why don't you tell us what you said to me, and we can take it from there.
All right. I'll be very honest with you. I don't remember what I told you.
Well, I can read it. I read it to these folks earlier. You said, okay, I gotta think to find this. Well, all right, I'll get back to you on that because I've gotta.
You said that African
but I know my position.
Colonized.
Well, what is your position? Just tell us that.
I know my position. If you want me to go ahead,
go ahead with your position.
Okay, very good. I think the kind of conference we had here in the United States, the US-Africa Leaders Summit, the primary beneficiary is the United States. As we all know, the United States is trying to counter China's influence in Africa. So this is similar to a China-Africa conference as well. I would say that is the US rebuttal version of what China has been doing, having these conferences where all the African presidents are brought over to China and they discuss these trade relations, they discuss the huge loans that China has been giving out to Africa, they discuss the huge infrastructure projects. So this is a contest between industrialized powers, if you were. What Africa really needs is to be able to have its own organic economic growth. And that will not happen so long as African countries are not allowed to industrialize. And African countries are not going to be allowed to industrialize if the West has its way. We know the history of the West in terms of its relations with Africa. We know the history of slavery. We know the history of colonialism. At the end of colonialism, what happened was that Africa had been converted into plantations for the industrialized West, for cheap labor, for cheap resources, primary resources, and for cheap and for ready-made consumer markets for the goods coming from the industrialized countries. And the setup initially was by the European powers that partitioned Africa at the Berlin Conference in 1884-85 and set up what they call colonies. After World War II, Europe was broke. So the United States became the major player globally and in Africa. So the United States took on the role that Europe used to exercise in Africa. And the US took sides because the US primary intention at that time, even before independence, and today was access to resources. So when Belgium was governing Congo, the US was happy to deal with Belgian Congo and get the uranium that allowed the US to make the atom bomb, including the one that was dropped on Japan. The uranium came from Belgium Congo. The US took sides after independence. When Belgium gave formal independence to the Congolese, but did not want independence in practice, wanted to continue dominating Congo's politics and have access to resources at its own terms. And the US sided with Belgium in eliminating Patrice Lumumba. A very good book is by Susan Williams, White Malice, which came out last year, very well documented. And the US also took sides against Kwame Nkrumah because he was a major advocate for Patrice Lumumba, sent his troops that were part of the UN force were told to protect Lumumba, contrary to the position of the West, which of course wanted to undermine his government. So ultimately, that also led to Patrice Lumumba's, to Kwame Nkrumah's downfall. And that was very significant because Kwame Nkrumah said, unless we unify as the United States of Africa, we will not be able to protect our resources and demand fair value, number one. We will not be able to industrialize and compete with the West. We will continue selling raw materials and being consumers for their products and providing cheap labor. And obviously, it turns out Nkrumah was 100% correct because that is the condition that prevails today in the 21st century. So ironically, and African leaders will not like listening to this, but here's the real truth. Almost all of the African leaders, if not all, serve the same role that the European colonial governors used to serve. They are supervisors of these multiple countries that have failed to unite. Otherwise, they would have become a power like China. So these are essentially supervisors. The budget is set by the World Bank or the IMF. You cannot tell me you're an independent country if an international institution like the World Bank, where the majority shareholders are the United States and the other Western powers, set your budget. and they tell you what you can or cannot do. So for example, the World Bank and IMF will not allow Africa to industrialize and start manufacturing automobiles, electronic equipment, and really compete with the United States and the other industrialized countries. So I'm running out of time. So let me summarize.
Nelson, 3 minutes, 3 minutes.
Sorry?
3 minutes.
Am I over my time?
Yes.
Can I have 30 seconds?
All right, 30 seconds.
Okay, here's the deal. In 1960, Ghana's per capita income was almost $200. China's was $89. Just think about that. That's not a very long time ago. What China did was it took control of its resources, it gets the value it wants for its resources, and it uses its resources to industrialize China. That has not happened in Africa. Thank you for my time.
Thank you, Milton. I appreciate that. I want to get back up a little bit to talk about the media coverage of Africa. And I see that Karen is here, Kiratiana, who is a columnist of the Washington Post and was formerly the Global Opinions editor, and has Africa in her background. And she wrote a piece at the time that Donald Trump famously called these countries and Haiti S-hole countries, saying that this is not all that unusual for the media. The media treats Africa the same way. So I want Karen to just tell us again, with just 3 minutes, what is wrong with media coverage of Africa today? If you can summarize it in 3 minutes.
I only have 3 minutes. I mean, and hi, I'm glad to be here, and I see a whole lot of friends here, and Emmanuel from Ghana, like, good to see you. And it's interesting, this question, because I think this very question actually is what got me started in journalism, and as a college student, challenging these perceptions about Africa, not only challenging the perceptions about Africa, but actively myself, as my parents are from Ghana, my mother's half Ghanaian and half Nigerian, but knowing at a very young age that Africa, its history, its politics, its place on the world stage was not a part of my education growing up. I had to go to an elite college basically to be able to learn about it. And my very first published piece was a rebuttal in the Daily Northwestern to a piece from a student who had gone to Ghana and talked about how she was on a public health trip and she dewormed every kid that came near her, and how the food was terrible. But what she got out of her trip was that her life in the US was so great and that she was grateful. And I was incensed and wrote a letter to the Daily Northwestern, and they said, you know what, you're right. We did not provide context about Ghana, about the country, and it painted a very one-dimensional picture. So that was sort of my journalistic debut, which was providing a corrective in a sense. And I think in the last, if I could summarize a good amount of the media coverage, when the media actually decides to pay attention to Africa, it is often, those images of poverty, of corruption, of and it leaks into, I think, in every area of journalism, and it's not just political journalism. I've written before, we're talking about the World Cup actually, and I distinctly remember when the Ghana defeated the US in, I think that was 2018. Was it 20? No, sorry, that was 2014, I believe. And the coverage of the Ghanaian team was, of the players themselves, was how they were somehow, relying on physical force and strength and intimidate, and they were intimidating, this, painting this picture, a beastly players, really. So you can kind of see that throughout different realms of coverage. I think you also tend to see a waxing and a waning of Africa coverage, depending on what's happening in the White House and depending on the priorities. Like in my time in Washington, in the Obama days. I remember Yali. I remember there was a lot of actually energy for diaspora initiatives. There was a lot of energy for, especially those of us who had one foot in the continent and one foot in America. There was a lot of even just stories about us. I remember that's also around the time of the Chimamanda Adichie's Americana, and there was just a lot of kind of, it was in the public discourse, the sort of the bridge building of Africa and America during the Obama time. Obviously, as I wrote, under the Trump era, that cratered. And so, yeah, I mean, I feel now, you know, as a journalist, I was in Ghana earlier this year, and I think, you know, I think now is a chance, and I think the Biden summit is a chance to be able to take that signal from the administration that this is a priority. I agree with the previous gentleman, though, that we have to do well to cover it from the angle of, I think, what is good for Africans, and to take the broader historical context of the international institutions that have played a role in holding the country's development back. And I think there needs to be a lot more of that. But I also am very keenly aware of the situation. When we're talking about Ghana a lot, as much as there is this rosy picture being painted of Ghana as a place historically for the diaspora to return. And I know the government is doing a lot of initiatives, year of return, and really just trying to market and brand itself. It's also having to contend with the fact that the economy has been in a free fall. The CD depreciated so much in the last year. People are really struggling. There's been a lot of the issues with the government and anti-LGBTQ laws. So, you know, as much as there's this need to correct narratives or to fill gaps and holes, it also doesn't mean that, you know, that we shut a blind eye to the things that are going wrong, and holding those government officials accountable, and understanding the sort of the fundamentals of the economies there. So that's how I'm seeing things now. I still continue to write about Africa, and yeah, I'm just looking forward to, as a columnist now, you know, connecting with those of you who are in the space, and just know that my phone lines are open, and would love to, you know, brainstorm ways that we can keep these conversations going in our pages, in our airwaves, and whatever platforms that we have. So
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. As John Yearwood, can you get from behind your iPad for a minute? Oh, maybe he's left us for a second then. Oh, there you are.
Hey, Richard.
Okay. All right. As an editor yourself who deals with Africa and has before, how do you see this about U.S. coverage of Africa?
Well, like Karen and many others, Mel Foote, been involved and worked with him for maybe 20 years or so. I've seen a lot of change in the coverage. The change in that there are more people, I think, that to some extent that look like us, Richard, who are interested in coverage of Africa. And I see more and more opportunities for that to happen. I mean, some of the majors are looking at some of the major publications are looking at Africa more seriously. One of the things I thought was, was good to see from this coverage. There were a number of major publications looking seriously at the coverage of this summit. I mean, I was involved in coverage of the last one, and I didn't see as much interest. Part of the reason, of course, there'd be more interest in this one is because you had almost 50 leaders coming to Washington, something that I don't think any of us had ever seen before. And the stories are continuing to come out, as you pointed out this morning. There was a good piece in the Washington Post about the summit. But what I think though is that even though I'm seeing more of it, I think there need to be more opportunities for us, not only to report about Africa in this country, but also to travel to the continent. And that's where organizations like NABJ and others can be helpful, trying to find the resources. The NABJ has a couple of ways that they fund journalist coverage of Africa. I would certainly love to see more of that happening. And the fact of the matter is, there are so many great stories to tell from Africa, and I think to some extent, people who look like us need to be at the forefront of telling these stories. I was talking to someone a couple of days ago from Africa who was making the point that so often, not exclusively, but so often, when journalists just pop into Africa who are not, as interested in the continent, a lot of the stories that they read about Africa are way off the mark. And so I think when, and I've been writing about Africa now for about 30 years or so, since a first trip to Tanzania many years ago, and since traveled through maybe 35 African countries and reported on a number of issues on the continent. But and I think if there's anything, I think coming out of this, there should be a recognition by many people that as you look at issues in Africa, that there is a lot more stories there, and we're literally just just looking at just the tip of the iceberg here. There's so much there to tell, and I think conversations like what you're having now, Richard, I think are really important to help continue to garner interest in the continent and get journalists thinking that Africa is continues to be a great beat to cover. And it's good to see that the New York Times and others are sending more people who look like us to the continent as their main Africa correspondents.
Very good, thank you, John. Now, since Ghana was mentioned, and we have Emmanuel here, Emmanuel Dugbivy, who spent time in the United States as a NABJ fellow at Columbia, and is now back in Ghana, who wrote a piece about how Americans generally see the whole issue of press freedom in Ghana and in Africa generally through rose-colored glasses. So I'd like Emmanuel to elaborate on that and to tell us what he thought about the Western coverage and the US coverage while he was in this country. 3 minutes though. Unmute, please. Unmute. Unmute, please. Unmute. Okay, you got to unmute. Benita, can we help him to unmute a little bit?
He's already unmuted. I'm not sure his sound, he's having problems with his sound.
Oh, okay.
He just muted himself, so
we can't hear you. Okay, well.
Can't hear him.
Why don't we
He
just
needs
send
to
him a
check his
message?
sound. He needs to check his sound settings on his side.
Okay, can you send him a message?
So why don't you go to the next person until
Okay,
he can get
let's send him a
together.
message All right, now I see Zadi is here, Zadi Zoku. And as I've said, he did the film on what Africans in the United States think about African Americans and vice versa. And he just became a US citizen, so we want to congratulate him for that. But since he's been living here in Massachusetts and has an opportunity to see our coverage of his native continent, I wonder what his thoughts might be.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, let me put the. I feel like there's not enough coverage Yeah, I feel like there's not enough coverage of the African continent here in the US, because I watch a lot of TV. I'm always watching TV, but I rarely see images from Africa unless we have a catastrophe or something like that over there. So I think we Africans living here, instead of waiting for people to show our continent, we should join efforts to make something about our own continent, showing stories, and that's what I'm trying to do. But most of the time, the news about Africa are just negative, and it's heartbreaking.
I hear you. Okay. Professor Wahutu, there you are at NYU. Glad to have you here. Your specialty is some of the tragic things that have happened there, and atrocities and what's going on in Sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, being here teaching at NYU, you too have had an opportunity to look at the way the United States views Africa, and particularly how it's reflected in the media. So I'm interested in your thoughts as well.
Thanks. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yes.
Good. I want to pick up on something Prof. Allimadi said about leaders on the continent, right? Because what has become very clear over the years is that leaders on the continent are operating in the ways sort of Frantz Fanon talked about, right? This idea that the colonized had to be very careful because they were running the risk of being seen of being jealous of the colonizer rather than wanting to actually overthrow and improve the lives of people. And we've sort of seen that with multiple types of leaders on the continent. So even when they do come here, Prof is right, they're operating as an extension of the colonial officer, right? The only difference being that they're African, they're Black, and they speak some native language, right? And the problem with this is they've been unwilling to kind of take that risk and flex the muscles they need to flex. In a continent as large as ours, as diverse as ours, you shouldn't be running to Washington, D.C. because the US president called you. Like, that should not be it. There's a lot of power on the continent. You sit tight and you say, no, you come visit us. You come and we will hold a forum. We shouldn't be running to China. We shouldn't be running to France for whatever type of Africa summit. And that is often for me a bone of frustration. But ironically, that bone of frustration then also moves into how the continent covers other countries on the continent, right? How Kenya, for example, talks about Nigeria, talks about Ghana, how Kenya talks about Uganda and Sudan. Because in my work, what I've tended to find is an African news organization is much more likely to lean into your BBC, your New York Times, your Washington Post, your CNNs for its coverage for things happening across the border, rather than even relying on local journalists that are inside country. And often this has been sold to us as it's economically expensive. It's a huge financial burden. And I often say, no, it's not. Because what you could do if something is happening in Lagos, I shouldn't buy that story from Reuters. I should engage with the journalist at The Guardian in Nigeria. I should engage with the journalist in Entebbe. I should engage with journalists in Dar es Salaam. I shouldn't buy the story from the New York Times. So what then is happening is the story of conflict on the continent for audiences within the continent. It's not being told by people in the continent, it's being told by news organizations from the global north. And to make matters even worse is that in a place such as Nairobi, they are much happier to quote a senator from Illinois to tell Kenyans what is happening in Juba than to quote the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Nairobi. Right, so this is a problem. A lot of people and my students come to class, they're upset about how the US covers the continent, and I look at them and I go, why should I care? I am more worried about how the continent covers itself, because the US is going to take cues based off of how we do it. And if we're buying the stories we're calling stereotypical and racist and publishing them in our newspapers, what's the incentive, right? And they will do the thing that makes them money, and we are buying it. So for me, the frustration with the leaders then seeps into frustrations with how journalism operates, right? And how much it has deviated from indigenous newspapers during colonization, who the colonialists called plagues because they were often pushing for change, right? It was in Nigeria where a local indigenous newspaper called Frederick Lugard a terrorist, all right, and an incompetent idiot, right? I mean, these are things that were happening on the continent. That has shifted. Who on the continent would call some European leader a terrorist today? They wouldn't, because that revolutionary spirit in African mainstream newspapers has completely disappeared, because good journalism is seen as New York Times journalism, is seen as Washington Post journalism, and that is the journalism we push back against as calling problematic, but yet still buy it, and yet still teach local journalists that this is how you do good journalism. All right, so I think the problem for me is not just what happens in the US, but what we do on the continent to allow what is happening in the US to happen. If the stories you're reading in the Daily Nation in Nairobi are from the New York Times and Reuters, and you're an American journalist, you move into Nairobi assuming that Kenyan journalists need to be taught how to be good journalists, and how they can practice good journalism. They're phenomenal journalists on the continent, and they can do phenomenal work. They're not being allowed to because of the way the profession has been set up, right? They're not being allowed to because of the histories of these newspapers. In Kenya, again, 2 of the leading newspapers were set up by settler colonialists, and they're still the leading newspapers today, right? So these ideas and the way the US views the continent, I think, are partly shaped by the way the continent talks about the continent and the voices that the continent gives a platform to in these newspapers, right? On these websites.
I hear you. I hear you.
Yeah.
Well, since
So,
we have a publisher and editor from the continent right here, Rodney Sieh is here from Liberia, editor and publisher of FrontPageAfrica, who also spent time in the United States. What do you have to say about that? Are you just parroting what the West is telling you?
It's been a very difficult journey for lots of, from my personal experience, because I remember during the Ebola crisis, when a lot of international or Western media were trying to get coverage of the crisis, it was difficult for them. So my own experience was that they contacted me because of the way we covered the Ebola crisis. I was featured, my newspaper was featured at an NPR radio about how we're covering Ebola. And because of that, a lot of international Western US media,
Oh, we lost you.
Reporters shadowed them covering the crisis. And most of our reporters shared bylines in those newspapers. So for the first time since I'm in this profession, to see Western media actually covering a crisis and sharing workload and bylines with with African journalists, that was a rare occasion for me. I think, although that was a rarity, I think a lot of time people covering Africa forget that we too have a story to tell. And I think part of the reason for this lack of interest in Africa is the social media. We've seen Instagram taking over, Facebook taking over. And so a lot of Africans are copying what the Western people are doing. They relating, I mean, they're finding stories that don't really have any meaning. If you put on American television, half of it is entertainment. Half of it is a dog caught in a tree, a cat caught under some bush. they call the cops to pick the cat, and those who are reading the news see as entertainment. So there's not really, how we cover it, but how to cover Africa, but it's the way to do it. And a lot of times people take for granted a lot of things that happen on this continent, unless there's some graphic image or some graphic war or something from images of the war or health crisis. There's not many Western media willing to give their front page or maybe their news network attention to the continent. And so we've seen a lot of things happen lately. A lot of the media houses in the US and other countries are cutting costs. So they're relying more heavily on nationals of these countries to really cover these crises for them. Those who can afford it, they actually trying to do some things about it, but it's just a very difficult time for them, a very difficult period for African journalists covering the news. And I think part of the difficulties we have into is that the resources is not there. Most African newspapers budgets don't even compare to what those in the Western media have. And so we just try to do the best we can in trying to get these stories covered. But the interpretation is that the US media have no interest in Africa. If you look at the newsrooms in the US, for example, most of them have cut costs on coverage from other countries, other parts of the world, especially Africa. Unless there's a bombing somewhere or some plane crash, you won't hear anything from Africa on the news. And it's a tragedy because we live in a world where everything is connected through social media, through Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, everyone's connected. So it's just a matter of how we see the world and how the world sees us. But in doing that, it paints a very bad picture that they just don't care about us. And we have to be the ones to drive our stories to the world. And I've been fortunate to start a publication that's become very influential, to drive stories that international media pick up. They contact us. And that's how it has to be, because we don't have an opportunity to tell our story the way we want to tell it. Nowadays, we can do that because of social media. Western media can pick up a story and they might want to get more information on the stories. And so they have to come to us to tell it. And that's the dilemma we face. And that's the difficulties of the challenges we face.
I hear you. Okay, I think we got stopped a minute. All right, thanks. Hazel Headley has a question, but before I get to Hazel, I want to ask Omar. Are you still here, Omar? Here in the beginning, from Somalia, who was at the conference. I'm not seeing you. Okay. Well, maybe he stepped away.
Richard, Omar is in Kigali. He's having a little difficulty connecting. He stopped there on his way to Mogadishu.
Okay, I thought he was still in this country. Okay, good. All right, well, Hazel, go ahead and ask your question then.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Actually, I want to say this first, that I own a newswire, the Tri-City Newswire, and we report on Africa every week. We get our news from the Global Information Network, GIN. It's out of New York, and I think that they do an incredible job in reporting on, all of Africa, wherever they can pull from. But if you all know of better places, or at least comparable places where we can get fair news to report to the Black community, to the community at large, I would be glad to know what those places are. My question is this: I had a bad experience recently. I was at the National Press Club, and Mel Foote was there, but I don't know if Mel saw this. Mel was receiving the President Biden's Lifetime Achievement Award, and it was by an African organization. I'll mess it up if I try to say the name of the organization, forgive me. But when they sung the Black national anthem, there was a whole table of people, Africans, who refused to stand. And there was a guy standing over them saying, come on, stand up, you gotta give some respect. I mean, he was actually begging them to stand and they refused to. So this is my question. What do Africans think of us? I mean, can we all get along? I mean, what was that about? If you have any idea at all.
I'll be very happy to respond to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can come in if you want.
Should I go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, first of all, there's a short video on YouTube that I recommend everybody watch. It's called "You Can't Hate the Roots of a Tree Without Hating the Tree." And it's Malcolm X speaking. And Malcolm said, when Africa, this is in maybe 62 or 63, he made this speech. When Africa was under colonial rule, the image of Africa that was decimated globally was of Africa of jungles, of Tarzan, of cannibals. And that's what shaped our perception of Africa. And in hating Africa, we didn't realize we were hating ourselves. And that's the point he was trying to make. You can't hate the roots of a tree without hating the tree itself, which is yourself. You can't hate the roots without hating yourself. So I say this, suggest that the reverse is also true. The image of our sisters in this country that is disseminated in Africa are also the negative images, similar to what was disseminated about Africans historically in Western global media. So they just don't know any better. They're totally ignorant. And when I came here to the United States, when I look back, I thought I also had knowledge. But once I got here, I found how ignorant I was as well. I didn't know of the existence of the Black national anthem historically. It was only after I came to the United States that I really started to understand the total history of the Black African experience in this country, which is not taught in Africa. It's not taught to many Africans. So they're totally woefully ignorant. And that would be my explanation.
Well, I think part of the portrayal for Africa in the media also comes to entertainment. I remember in 2001, Jay-Z made a song called Girls, Girls, Girls. And that song didn't go well on the continent, at least in my friends in Ghana, Nigeria, and Liberia were offended by the fact that Jay-Z, I think the exact lyrics he had, if I'm not mistaken, was, I got this African chick with Eddie Murphy on the skull. She like, Jigga man, why you treat me like an animal? I'm like, excuse me, Miss Fufu, but when I met your ass, you was dead, broken, naked, and now you want half. And I think those kind of lyrics, because of the popularity of Jay-Z on the continent, people can tend to like take him like a god in some places. And so those lyrics and this music, although back in the day it was not as rampant as it is now with all this Me Too movement, all these modern cancel culture thing going on, but it just tells you that how social media and how the game has changed, because I'm pretty sure if that song was made today, it would have been a different backlash for Jay-Z. But it's the way the media, the Western media, portray these, portray Africa, portray Africans. There are a lot of talented Africans, a lot of smart Africans in every aspect of life, in sports, entertainment, and other aspects, education, politics. There are a lot of Africans serving the U.S. Congress. And so there are a lot of, difficulties in the way they portray the continent. And for Africans to sit in a room in the West, in America, and have an anthem being played and they're sitting down, tells you that they just following what the culture in America has taught them. And so that's how they see it. And I think it's all about adaptation, about how they see the world, about how they grow up. Children who grew up in Africa are different from those who grew up in the West because the cultures are different, the lifestyles are different. And we have to be the ones to try to educate. But nowadays it's different because everything is through social media. Everything is on Instagram, everything is on Facebook. So the media, not just in Africa, but in the West, struggling now to tell the stories because every Tom, Dick, and Harry now is a journalist. Once you have a page on Facebook, you have a page on Instagram, you can tell your own story. You can come and say, tell someone, no, something happened in the area and this happening. People believe what you say because it's on social media. And that is the biggest challenge we are having today as journalists. It's complicating the fact that African stories are not just not being told, but also we're competing with the social media component of the media, of journalism. And that is a problem. And that's why you see, like Haley was saying, someone can sit in the room and have an anthem being played, and it means nothing to them because they're in a country where they're not respected or they're not taken seriously.
Interesting. Okay, we have. I see some hands up here. Let me just go horizontal here. Jill Humphreys, Dorothy Davis, Ken Walker. Okay, we're going to get the three of you. And I do have to point out though, that Tanzadi is Zoku. That's exactly what his film found in terms of African Americans talking their view of Africans and Africans' view of African Americans, and that the media in each place takes the worst of each of the other side and projects that onto the populace, and that's why we have what we have. And also, I think Ken Walker can talk about this, and Maureen Bunyan at the roundtable where we had this discussion. They each talked about how these negative things from Black America seeped into the countries to other Black countries, and such as use of the N-word. Again, it wasn't so much social media, it was just the mainstream media that was doing that. But all right, let me go to Jill Humphreys, and then, as I said, Dorothy, and then Ken.
So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm actually a social scientist that is studying journalists. And so I actually had, yes, I'm Dr. Jill Humphreys. And so I actually had media credentials, which I applied for and received, representing Spotlight Africa. And I had an opportunity to interview Simon Ateba, who was the White House correspondent that's assigned. And I had almost a 2-hour conversation with him about his interaction and dynamic with Karine Jean-Pierre. She's the White House president's spokesperson. And I really asked him, I said, from someone looking on the outside to see two Black people, an African and an Haitian, both Black immigrants, fighting in this way, could you please explain to me what's really going on institutionally? Because neither one of you have any power. You're operating within an institutional context, right? But neither of you have power, but you have influence. So what's really going on behind this dynamic of Ms. Peri not allowing you to ask questions, right? And then the backlash that he explained to me that he's received from his other fellow journalists, and then institutionally, what is it about Africa not being presented or spoken about? And so I'm raising the question here with the journalists. I actually sent a text to Karen, but if someone who has more insight about the larger institutional context of which these two Black people are fighting in front of an international audience and how it's viewed. And then the other question I asked him was, has there been attempts for mediation by the National Association of Black Journalists? Because what I don't want to happen is to see either one of you being used by the white institutional context, him going on the Tucker Carlson show, you may have seen that where they interviewed him, and it's being used by the right. His interview is now being used by the right. So if someone could kind of shed some light on that, but more importantly, how do we do an intervention, right, to squash this? Because I do believe it's negative for presenting Africa, right? But then also the larger context for those of us who are in the diaspora. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Let's go to Dorothy, and then we can answer those questions.
I have several things to say, and I have to give context. My father was Griff Davis, and he was the first roving editor for Ebony, and he reported from Africa in 1949 and kept going. He was responsible for helping Ebony find stories in Africa that were reported over here. And he was friends with Arabelle.
You gotta tell us your dad's name.
Griff Davis.
All right.
Okay, so he was a pioneer international journalist, photographer, and U.S. Foreign Service officer. And that is my context, okay? Now, I was born in Liberia because he was there and grew up in Africa and basically learned the U.S. backwards because I didn't really come to the U.S. until I was about 7 or 8 and then traveled. But my point here is there has been a systematized way of keeping Africans from knowing about African Americans in terms of our true story. And that has been perpetuated by the US government in terms of what has been projected to Africa in different images, also in terms of our entertainment industry, movies and so forth, have not depicted us or our real stories. I went to Columbia Journalism School because I was incensed with the way a reporter in the New York Times was covering South Africa at the time, apartheid. It seemed like they were going to the officials who at that point were white South Africans to get the official word about whatever was going on in South Africa, instead of going to essentially the liberation movement type people who were actually fighting the cause. I feel like there is, luckily, there is a growing interest in Africa and learning more about Africa in its multi-dimensions. It is a continent full of different countries within countries. There's so many stories. And I feel like we are ignorant on our side, meaning the US side. We are ignorant about accepting that we too are multi-dimensional, and we don't like to reflect that in our stories. I think also we need to start our own businesses, our own journalism, media outlets, and not rely on the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever. And I think that's what happened in terms of Ebony and other types of Black media, that they went out and got stories that others did not have. And we've lost that. It also, in terms of Ebony was like the internet at the time between what was happening in Africa in terms of the independence movement and so forth, and what was happening here in terms of the civil rights movement. They were watching us and we were watching them in terms of getting inspiration to go forward and to create, to come to independence. The US-Africa Summit, I think, is a great thing. I thought it was an excellent vehicle from the standpoint of just making Americans aware that there are 49 heads of state in Africa, period. I mean, that's like monumental in and of itself, to just shatter that kind of concept. You know, when you see the group, the family picture or whatever, you have the group of them standing there, the fact that, whoa, you know, we only had one Black president. They have 49 Black presidents, and it's consistent. You know what I mean? It's increments like that. I mean, we don't teach Africa in our schools. Nobody hears anything about Africa in elementary school. Nobody goes and talks to their Ghanaian neighbor. You know,
okay, Dorothy, we gotta cut you off. Next, Nolu.
Wow, wow. Thank you,
Okay,
Dorothy.
we got you.
I was, it's hard to follow Dorothy because there's just a lot, you know?
Right.
And actually, my question, I really want to hear, and for those who don't know my backstory, I spent 10 years on the continent as a journalist, public affairs consultant, blah, 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 okay? Howsoever, I want to hear from what I call the continental Africans, the ones actually born on the continent, Zadi, Milton, the Liberian brother, I didn't get his name, Karen and others who are, you know, have that kind of experience. Yes, the media is doubtless, no doubt, a big part of the problem. But as I believe it was Milton and others have said, the real problem is African leadership or the lack thereof, okay? And so my question is, how is there any sign that that's being fixed? You know, with the AU, you have this African continental free trade, whatever. You got AGOA that's been around forever. Well, not forever, maybe 20 years, 20, 30 years by now. I'm just wondering and want to hear from our African brothers and sisters, is there any movement to deal with this whole African leadership? Because I really believe that it's the Africans and some, maybe few of us African Americans who've had deep experience in both places that have to bring about some change. But as you said, they're just sort of caretakers. They're just doing what the other people did. So that's what I want to hear from them. You know, it's a rich continent with a lot of poor leadership, and things really have got to change. And I want to hear from the brothers and sisters. So that's my question.
Okay.
Can I say something?
Oh, yes. Who is that?
Is that it?
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that I have a, yeah, can I?
Please, but be brief, but go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I would say that as a guy from French-speaking Africa, if we can say it like that, we have a different experience, and there are a lot of things going on the continent, on this part of the continent. In terms of movement, because of the internet, many young Africans right now in this part of Africa are aware of the inefficiency of our leaders. And you have some influencers who are very influent. I'm going to tell a few names here. I'm sure many of you have never heard about them, but they are very influential on the continent. One is Kemi Seba. He's a French, from France and Benin, but he left France to live in Benin now, and is very influential. You have people like Franklin Nyamsi, who is professor in France, is from Cameroon and Cote d'Ivoire, and he has millions of followers. And you even have the lady we call the Lady of Sochi. I forgot her name, but she was expelled from Cote d'Ivoire because the president thought that she was criticizing France and our leaders too much. So she was expelled. She lives in Switzerland right now. So there's a vast movement in Francophone Africa right now through the internet. And a lot of young people right now are aware of everything. So things are moving on this part of the continent. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. Let me just say, Ken Walker will be next, that we can't get everybody and have everybody say what they'd like to say on the, orally. So please make liberal use of the chat room to make all of your points that you may not be able to, we may not have time for in this, this platform. So go ahead. Now, Ken Walker is next.
Thank you. Yes, there still are serious differences and challenges in relationships between African Americans and Africans. And part of it is in the popular representations, mostly popular music these days, but also until very recently, other mass media representations of Black people. I had a very difficult time during the 20 years I lived in Africa to convince young Africans their use of the word nigger was deeply offensive to me, and they should disregard it. And the most common retort was, well, it might have been offensive the way y'all used it, but we use it in a different way. We use it with love and affection.
Mm.
I
Wow.
think, seriously, I think a part of this difficulty stems from the insistence of the owners of white media, in the US especially, in inhibiting that communication. It was only relatively recently, I think, I may have been among the first African-American journalists to be based and assigned in Africa. But my first trip to Africa occurred when I was working for the Washington Star, and I wanted to visit South Africa. They were then owned by Time magazine, and they had a functionary in charge. Murray Gart was his name. And so after several months of pleading and maneuvering to be sent, he finally said, okay, yeah, great, you can go, but you have to pay for it yourself. This, for me, was victory. And I said, yeah, I'll take that deal. And I took it and spent several months there. And when I got back, he then wanted to say that, well, you were on a private trip and we can't print this. And I basically threatened to stand in front of the newspaper and denounce them for as long as it took for them to change their minds, and they did. But I understand why they don't want white power structure and white media organizations don't want that free communications among us, because they're part of the power structure. They understand that they are part of the system that continues to suppress and exploit Africans and their resources. And as such, their employees, meaning reporters, including Black reporters, are part of that process of repression. Now, Black journalists is now not so much, not so unusual, but Black journalists started being sent to Africa about the same time and for the same reasons that Black journalists were assigned to cover riots in America. It was basically, the white people understood that it was not as safe for them to do it, and it was less attractive than other foreign assignments, and so they continued to. So then they began to assign Black journalists to do it, but we still have a lot of work to do in communicating with one another and overcoming the hatred and the stereotypes that are still very much a part of our relationship and communications.
All right, Joel Dreyfus.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments. I lived in Africa as a kid, and in fact in Liberia, and was an eyewitness to the independence of a number of African countries by virtue of being there in the late 50s and early 60s. When we talk about what should journalists know about Africa, it starts with everything from the size of the continent to the fact that there was a website called Africa's Not a Country. I think it's still around. The knowledge is just dismal. But being here in Paris most of the time now, I see some good programming about Africa that is in the right direction. CNN International has a couple of shows, one called Focus on Africa. The BBC does a news show as well as an arts and culture show on the weekends. And that's pretty good. So there are some, Al Jazeera does some very good Africa coverage. So there are some bright spots in a very dismal landscape.
Okay. Can you hear us?
Richard, we cannot hear you.
Can't hear you.
Richard, we can't hear you.
Can't hear me.
There we go.
Okay. All right. Let me get my face from looking like a zebra. All right. Okay. I was trying to find out whether Emmanuel, his issue was resolved.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes. Now we can hear you.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for having me. Well, I think there's a certain concept, a notion that over time has developed about how African journalists should conduct themselves, and in terms of what they cover from home, where they live. Having lived and worked in Ghana for 32 years, I've come to realize and see that foreign journalists don't see African journalism in its real context as journalism that covers the continent from the perspectives of journalists who have lived, studied, and grown on the continent. So it's often common to see that we are not listened to and we are not taken seriously. I will give you a few examples. New York Times would have a bureau for Africa, and the bureau chief lives in Johannesburg, and he covers Accra. And Allimadi gave some examples where you would find that.
Will you name names, please?
So for example, the New York Times advertised for an Africa bureau chief. And if you read the advertisement, it goes on to describe Africa like a jungle, promising this reporter, this exotic experience of living in Africa and seeing, all these wildlife and so on and so forth. It's that advertisement generated a lot of controversy online and was later pulled down, and New York Times has had to apologize. That's the typical example, how the Western media perceives journalism or the African continent. How do we change that? I've heard people say we don't have African media correspondents, say Ghanaian newspapers don't have correspondents across the border in Togo, for instance. We don't have a correspondent for the largest newspaper in Ghana in Lagos. They have to depend on, like someone said, on Reuters, on Bloomberg. In fact, I get to read about inflation news and analysis on Ghana from Bloomberg News most of the time. Why? Because the media in Ghana doesn't, as it were, have the resources nor the training. And that's a really critical part of the challenge. Most of the journalists are not properly trained. They don't have the skills to report the way they should. And for the few journalists who do the reporting that is considered good quality critical reporting, they are seen as enemies of the state. And because of that, for instance, the New York Times reporter can't get an interview with the president of Ghana so easily, or the Newsweek, but I can't get an interview with the president of my country, because I'm considered a critical journalist who doesn't sing the praises of the government in power. And someone goes on to talk about foreign influence and manipulations that lead to corruption. Right. So most of these African governments and leadership don't seem to be comfortable with critical journalists like me and others. And as you are aware, in 2019, one journalist was shot dead in broad daylight in the center of Accra, and the killers haven't been found as yet. And we've heard more often than not, government officials go in public to say he wasn't even a journalist. but no one is telling us what the state is doing to arrest the perpetrators of the murder. So the journalists who do what you will consider responsible, accountable, journalism that hold power to account and speaks truth to power, are often endangered species that don't have the resources. For instance, if I want to go and cover an incident in the northern part of Ghana, I wouldn't be able to afford it because my news organization does not generate revenue, because no advertiser works with us. But the media organizations that have the funding and resources to go to the north and report would rather report an election campaign, rather than report on important issues like illegal logging of rosewood that are shipped to China, for instance, or concentrate and focus on pollution, air pollution, river pollutions. They would do more sensational stories rather than do in-depth stories. So the question is, how do we break this kind of situation and system that more or less disenfranchises or disenables competent and committed journalists from doing their work? You have no resources, nobody will speak to you, government officials won't grant you interview. Like I was doing an investigation of tax avoidance that was going to cost the country over 400 million cedis. And it took me 6 months to get the Ghana Revenue Authority officials to give me a comment. They wouldn't speak to me, but they would jump from one radio station to the other, speaking about all other interesting topics that are of interest to them. So the challenge is quite much bigger than you see it from where you sit. For those of us who are right here in the middle of the struggle to as it were, serve the public interest with the journalism that counts, it's a tough call, but we have to do it. But doing it requires a lot of support. It requires a lot of courage, which we often don't see to have in abundance.
Thank you, Emmanuel. That was enlightening. Let me go to Karen Dunlap, then Barbara Reynolds, and then Professor Wahutu.
Yeah, Emmanuel, that was very important. The matters of training and protection of journalists, those are very important topics. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for all those who presented today. I kind of want to follow Nolu's conversation. I think Azadi kind of talked about some outstanding leaders who are developing. At the beginning of this conversation, we talked about the need for nations to develop, to use their own resources and to industrialize. And my question is, where are the bright spots on that? Where are the countries, the activities that are taking place where you see nations using their own resources and moving toward industrialization? Joe talked about a little bit in his article. He mentioned work with NASA. There's talk about building cars. Where are the bright spots in industrialization in Africa?
I can respond to that.
Please do.
I think Ethiopia had actually started. Unfortunately, very sadly, a lot of it has been rolled back because of the war between the federal government and the Tigray region. Ethiopia had started to build its own domestic factories using its own raw materials, which is precisely what every African country needs to do. I mean, for some products that need a bigger consumer market base, they should do it collectively. And this goes back to what Melvin said in the beginning. They need to have at least a common agenda on some issues. So for example, if one country is designated as the producer of automobiles, then they should not have another African country duplicating that. That other African country should take on another product. Because if you're producing cars, the cost is very high. So you need a wide consumer base to have an effective demand for the investment, number one. Number two, you're going to face a major challenge from the World Bank. And that goes to the point I made on the chat, that we need to have more and more stories about how the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization holds back Africa's development, because you won't get any access to capital. If the World Bank shuts you down, then you're not going to get access from private banks either in an international market. And every country needs credit to survive. Look at what's happened to Zimbabwe, brought down to its knees because of the sanctions after the late Robert Mugabe's government redistributed the land from the 6 or
Can't hear you. Something went wrong.
started it.
Okay.
But even the conversation alone, if you start that, you're in danger. Thomas Sankara tried just talking about it, and he was eliminated in Burkina Faso.
My goodness. Okay, Barbara Reynolds. Unmute, please.
Barbara Reynolds, you're next.
Unmute.
This has been a rewarding and rich conversation, but when I let people know that I was going to be listening on this panel, I was surprised because I got so many emails saying, well, that's well and good what Biden is doing with Africa, but what about us? What about slavery? What about reparations? And I just want to know, should this even be a part of what we're talking about with Africa? Can we get anything from this participation to boost up this reparations issue, or should we just say that Biden's and this meeting is great, and so we don't want to drag our issues in there? But I'm just trying to see what am I going to say to people who are saying, oh, that's great about Africa, but what about African Americans?
Okay, what's the answer, somebody?
Somebody.
I think it's I've always viewed it as a unified situation, Barbara.
Yes.
I view the relationship between Africans in the diaspora and here and Western powers through the lens of restorative justice, meaning that somebody needs to pay for the damage that's been done. Now, a lot of damage has been done there. A lot of damage has been and is being done here. And until we can begin to get into forums to litigate those issues, we're just whistling Dixie, if I can use that term. We need to get into forums to litigate the actual injustice and damages that have been and are being done, and then decide on some basis for restorative reparatory justice. So I don't view these as separate issues at all, Barbara. I think it's all one of a piece.
Thanks,
Ken. Professor Wahutu.
If I could respond to that as well.
Who's speaking?
Oh, this is Karen.
Oh, I can't see.
Yeah, very quickly.
I mean, very quickly, yes.
It's obviously, I agree that at least in my work, again, as someone who very much, was born here, but has roots also in the continent, I find my work spanning the sort of the global injustice of it all, and recognizing that the slavery and the centuries of the depletion, not just of Africa's sort of resources, but of the culture, of the literal people who were taken from their families, from the continent, that, you can argue Africa is still has not recovered from that, is not recovered from that as well. What I do find worrying is the us versus them, is the, are we, who's getting reparations first? When are we in line? As I put in the chat, I do find the, specifically the online movement, ADOS, that has been targeting particularly, Africans, African immigrants. I find them using the tools of the white supremacists, honestly, and dividing and purposely erasing a long history of the synergies between African colonial independence movements and the civil rights movements here. It was always looked upon as a global struggle. There's a lot to talk about whether, you know, Pan-Africanism and all of that has succeeded or not, Afro-pessimism and all of that. But I do think that these are why these conversations are important. And I think that, you know, especially us as journalists, those of us who are writers, what I try to do is to, as much as I can, connect the struggles here in America to the global struggles, the struggles in Africa, to perhaps what's going on in the Caribbean, Brazil, Latin America, right? So the more that we can at least educate and push for education, even, you know, in schools towards that more kind of internationalist context, I'd hope that we'd be able to again, push on the political end, very much for these, for reparations for us all.
I would like to jump in here, just.
Well, let me get the Professor Wahutu and then Dorothy, okay? Yeah.
Thanks. So I really admire Karen's work, so I'm going to build off of her immediate comment to get to my next thing. I think, to Karen's point about this scarcity approach to these conversations being problematic. Did I? Okay. Being problematic for me is often best encapsulated by somebody else's point in the chat, Melvin Claxton's, but the journalist Keith Richburg, who wrote, and I agree with Melvin here, one of the racist books I've ever read about the continent, right? And it was this depiction of the continent as a place that has roving bands of werewolves almost, just eating each other, right? And this brings the hesitation, my hesitation to these conversations about sending journalists to the continent, right? And I think that has to shift to, as Emmanuel said, having real conversations about what journalism is and what journalism looks like on the continent, but also having real conversations of what the continent is, right? The continent is a space that has fractured loyalties. And often these loyalties are not even to the continent, they're outside. So when Emmanuel is saying, a Western journalist can reach the president of Ghana and I cannot, it's because the president of Ghana is dancing to the tune of whiteness, right? That's not new. That is the president of Ghana, there's the president of Kenya, my home country. That is everybody. Everybody wants to dance to this particular tune and leave out not just local journalists who would hold them to account, but also local voices. And it is a problem that is societal. And often we tend to go, journalism this and leaders this. And I go, well, no. What would convince a Kenyan to use Uber and not a local ride-hailing app is because Uber is American, right? And those things seep into the psyche of journalists who live in these particular societies. So there is a conversation to be had, but about these global kind of movements, right? But there is a warning to be expressed as well, that these movements have to move beyond this scarcity narrative that is either us or you, and figure out ways, as Nkrumah was arguing about, as Leopold Senghor was arguing about, figure out ways to form a transnational movement that holds power to account. Not some power, power period, right? This moves from the US to the French and what they're doing in their former colonies, to the Brits, to the Spanish and the Portuguese, everyone. Let's hold them to account and go, how can these structures work for us, rather than keep on extracting from the continent to the benefit of maybe 40 or 50 older African men who are worth millions and billions of dollars, right? Yet people can't even afford food or bread and are being propped up by external governments. And that's, I think, it's important to have these conversations about global connectivities. It's also important to remember that just because journalist X is Black doesn't mean they have the best interests of the continent at heart. Just because journalist Y is African doesn't mean they have the best interests of the continent at heart. And we need to recognize these as operating in the same space and hold everybody to account. I hold my African journalists that I work with to a higher account because I believe they have a much more important role than the external folks. The external folks will follow our lead, but we have to set the tune. We have to operate like tigers in the wild. We don't have to keep on insisting we're tigers. Do what tigers do, eat, hunt, let's move on. And I think that's an important bit to have in these conversations.
Agreed. All right,
I wanted to bring up the fact that when George Floyd was killed, it resonated around the world. And the Africa group at the UN in Geneva required that the Human Rights Council come up with a way to deal with systemic racism. And in many ways, it woke up the African side, the Caribbean side, to what is happening in America to African Americans. And it also was a linkage. So I'm bringing this up because my client, the Congressional Black Caucus Institute, I am their UN rep. And I am involved in the International Decade of People of African Descent that basically talks about all of our common issues from whatever angle, and colonialism, slavery, genocide, whatever. And I don't hear any stories about that anywhere in the US. It's been going on for 9 years. It's a decade. We're trying to move it to 2 decades. There's also, last week, there was a forum called the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. It was 4 days long, and it represented the entire diaspora in Geneva. And we have someone here, his name is Justin Hansford, and he represents the US on that permanent forum. He was recommended by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, by Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, different ones, but he is not beholden to the US government. He is independent. He's out of Howard University. And there needs to be some conversations or some stories about the fact that this is going on globally, and it's actually uniting people across the African diaspora in terms of issues that are common to all of us.
What's going on globally?
What, the International Decade for People of African Descent?
Oh, yeah. Well, I've written about that as well. But I think the issue there really is that the United States really doesn't care about the United Nations. And so it gets very
that's what my job is with this Congressional Black Caucus Institute, is to connect the fact that that African Americans were involved in the creation of the UN. Yes. You know, like W.B. Du Bois was there, yes. Mary McLeod Bethune, all of that is to, it's to bring the fact, is to paint us into the international picture, no matter what our quote government says.
Right. Gotcha. Okay, Emmanuel, and then we've got to move on. Emmanuel.
Thank you very much. Speaking of how to empower Africa economically, you look at, the cocoa industry, for instance. Every year, Ghana has the cocoa board that goes around buying cocoa from cocoa farmers in Ghana. But each year they have to buy cocoa, they have to go to Western banks to borrow about $1.2 billion. And they've been doing that for 60 years now. It's become impossible to imagine how Ghana can be economically empowered if Ghana has to borrow money every year to buy cocoa from its own farmers. But there's even a far more disturbing aspect of this cocoa business, where if I grow cocoa in Ghana as a farmer, I can't use my cocoa to produce chocolate. It's against the law. I would have to sell the cocoa to the Ghana Cocoa Board, which itself has gone to borrow money from Western banks to be able to, buy the cocoa from the farmers and then sell it on the international market. And we all know the value of chocolate, the primary product that gets, from cocoa. The chocolate industry is worth about $100 billion a year. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, the two largest producers of cocoa in Africa, don't even get 3% of that. And there is a conversation that Africa must add value to its natural resources. And we're talking about Africa industrializing. How does Africa do that? How does Africa empower itself? When we have bad governance, when we have misappropriation and mismanagement of public funds, you have African presidents, spending so much money on birthday parties, money from state coffers being used for things that can't be accounted for. For instance, if you come to Ghana, hundreds of millions of dollars were given to Ghana in aid to support the fight against COVID-19. The government has only been able to account for $12 million of that several $100 million. So how do we empower Africa so Africa can be in the position to tell its own story? But once you are economically disempowered, you can't even tell your own story because you don't have the power to tell your own story. It's an economic game. How do we do that? How do we do that when there is so much unaccountable leadership on the continent? So you look at the relationship between Africans and the diaspora, Africans in America, African Americans. And most African Americans come to Africa or they come to Ghana on pilgrimage and they love to be here and they enjoy the experience and then they go back. And then what after the reconnection? How do we build synergy? How do we build that conversation where we build and that power and energy together to transform and change the narratives? Because the narratives are really, really depressing. Very depressing to the extent that sometimes most Africans feel the only way out of the situation is to get out of Africa. As I speak to you now, most African young people, particularly in Ghana, are looking for the way out of the country, out of the continent. How do we make the continent feel like home to everyone else? How do we make the continent feel like, Africa belongs to Africans? How do we develop and build a sustainable economy? How do we deal with corruption that is costing our continent so much? Illicit financial flows, where monies are ferried out of Africa to tax havens in Europe, in America, elsewhere, and Africa is impoverished. And then we can have a voice because we don't have the economic power to speak out. We don't even have the means to speak out because you need funds, you need economics to be able to stand up and speak. Someone tried some time ago to have a social media platform for Africans. It never worked. In Ghana, someone started a cab hailing app. It never worked. But how come Uber and Bolt are working? Is it because they are from America? How do we build Africa? We need that economic power, that economic strength to be able to build Africa. Without that, we can't move forward. And that's a fact.
I think that's an excellent point. And it's pretty damning what you say about people trying to get out of Africa when, particularly in Ghana, when all these American Black organizations are taking their membership to Ghana to look at the, what's it called, the place where the slaves were held before they were shipped overseas, that kind of thing. All right, so we have to start our introductions because we're running out of time. But I think it's very interesting that the issue of Russia and China, which have dominated media coverage of U.S. relations with Africa, has barely been mentioned in this conversation. So I wonder whether that's why that might be. When we go, through these introductions, some people might comment on that. And the other thing is we've outlined all the problems, or not all the problems, but a lot of the problems. But did this conference, U.S. African Leaders Summit, give anybody any hope that these problems will be addressed and resolved? So let's start with the introductions. Emmanuel, you can introduce yourself and then we'll go around. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Just introduce yourself, please.
Well, my name is Emmanuel Dugbevi. I'm the managing editor of Ghana Business News, a news website that I set up 14 years ago. And I've also set up an organization called NewsBridge Africa with the main aim of training journalists in Ghana and across the continent.
Thank you. All right, Jill Humphreys.
I apologize. I was multitasking. So this is an introduction very quickly.
Yes, introduction.
I'm sorry. So I'm a social scientist who has been working in Africa over 30-something years. I currently do a lot of work with U.S. Africa Institute and Dr. Belay out of Los Angeles, and I'm a CFA member. Thanks, Mel.
Okay, very good. Dorothy. Unmute, please.
There we
Unmute.
go.
Okay.
I'm Dorothy Davis. I'm president of Dorothy M. Davis Consulting and Griffith J. Davis Photographs and Archives. I specialize in international development communications and work with the United Nations
Very
and
good.
the Congressional Black Caucus Institute.
Very good.
Richard, we can't hear you.
Professor Wahutu.
Thanks. I am Jay Wahutu. I'm an assistant professor at NYU. I work at the intersection of genocide and mass atrocities on the continent and African journalism, specifically interested in how African journalists cover events of mass violence and human rights violations on the continent. I also do work on data privacy and data manipulation, and largely currently my work is focused on this, what I call Silicon Valley's colonialist approach and entry into Africa's cyberspace, and trying to imagine ways in which the continent can A, push back against data collection and data extraction, and B, rely on existing laws to kind of try and change the way tech companies operate on the continent.
Richard, we can't hear you.
Yes, I think people know how to get in touch with you from the chat room, I'm sure. Barbara Reynolds.
Yes, I celebrate 60 years in journalism. I was a opinion editor for USA Today. For 13 years, I've written for Ebony Jet, Encore, Essence. I've had 3 chairs in journalism, including one at FAMU. I've written 8 books. The best known is the memoirs of Coretta Scott King, and I write for the Tri-Ethnic Newswire.
Thank you, Barbara. Karen Dunlap. Unmute, please.
I'm sorry, I hit it. President Emerita of the Poynter Institute, where we started the Institute for the Advancement of Journalism in St. Petersburg and Johannesburg years ago. I'm not sure if it's still going. Having retired, I still do some teaching, do some writing, do some work on Sirius XM and community work in Nashville, although I tend to be living in Tampa.
All right. Joel Dreyfus. Joel Dreyfus.
Hi, what can I say? 50-year career in journalism, co-founder of NABJ, born in one of these fecal orifice countries, Haiti. Immigrated here as a kid after living in West Africa with my family, where my father worked, and still living in Paris and observing the French view of Africa with some amusement. It's crumbling, by the way, and there's a lot of investigative reporting taking place about the corruption in between French politicians and African leaders for the most part. One of the interesting things is, in at least one case, Libya financed the presidential campaign of a French candidate.
Wow.
So it's an unusual twist that we haven't seen in the US yet, as far as we know.
There's still time. Okay, Ken Walker.
Same as Joel, roughly 50 years in the business before retiring, starting off in print, moving from there to television journalism at ABC News, and from there to radio journalism as the Africa Bureau Chief for National Public Radio. I lived in Africa for 20 years, never intended to come back, but had to for family reasons. And so I got a chance to look at condition, African condition, and the situation for African journalists from various perspectives, from the local police beat to international dimensions. And I think I have a pretty clear picture of the commonality, white supremacy and all its aspects.
All right, thanks, Ken. John Yearwood.
Hey, Richard, John Yearwood. I'm the editorial director for diversity and culture at Politico. And Richard, I want to say this is a really, really good discussion, and thanks for being really a force in helping to make it happen. Let me just see if I can answer really quickly, Richard, a question that someone had in terms of what's going on. And certainly there are a lot of challenges in Africa, but what we've seen in the last few years in terms of the whole issue of development and democracy, if you look at what's happening in Zambia, for example, with the new president Hichilema, he's doing a lot of things there, and he's becoming a real rock star on the continent in terms of moving a country forward democratically. I mean, as it relates to the free press. I remember being in Zambia a few years ago when the previous president shut down some of the major media houses. He has been really adamant in saying that the press has a responsibility to report and has not been instead of closing, has been opening organizations. And also, I want to point out one other thing about what the U.S. government is doing around the Import-Export Bank, which has a new president, Rita Jo Lewis, who's African-American. She has a mandate to improve and increase business between the US and Africa. And so far, since she's been appointed by Biden in this new job, she has developed and worked on over $7 or $8 billion in deals between the US and Africa. And she has pledged to do a lot more. So there are some things happening, and despite the challenges. And thanks again, Richard, for this really enlightening conversation.
Well, thank you for the idea, John. All right, Mel Foote wanted to say a few closing words, and just a few.
Yeah, first of all, I think it was great, Richard. Thank you very much for organizing this. For me, it was enlightening. And rarely do I sit through a discussion like this without having my 2 cents. But I want to say that my mother always told me, don't agonize, organize. Yes. And it's very easy to get mad. And I'm also missing the voices of young people. And somehow you guys have got to make the connection to the next generation right now. I met a bunch
we had 4 Howard students on the call.
But we need to have more of the voices of the next generation now, because all of us are 60, 70, and beyond on this call. And I just want to say that's the main thing. But I want to be involved. I think it behooves you to engage. I work with all the folks in the administration. I work with Dana Banks, Denise Laurent, all of them. I helped them to put this summit together. And so I've seen a lot of the insides of it. And there's some great African Americans involved in this. But just keep in mind that part of the overall strategy is divide and conquer. Black Americans are being pushed out, and we've been replaced by African immigrants who are being trained in North Dakota, Kansas, way out in the boondocks. They come to Washington. They don't want to have anything to do with me. They've been told, stay away from Black Lives Matter. And so we got to understand that we're actually being pitted against one another. And sure enough, you'll see a black face, might be a Nigerian American, but they won't be sympathetic to the causes of African Americans. So the games are still being played. John Lewis, if he could talk right now, he would be saying these kinds of things. A lot of us think that everything is, the civil rights struggle is over. It's not, or colonialism is over. It's not. And so we have to make sure we pave the way for the next generation. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Mel, for agreeing to do this. Melvin,
Richard, can I just jump in very quickly? I just want to counter what Mel Foote said. I want to answer his question, and I'm going to go. Hi, Todd Stephen Burrows. Melvin, here's where they are. I want to tell you where they are. I put in the chat, there's an international news media organization. They have an annual conference for the last 2-3 years. They've had an annual 2-day conference on African journalism. This is where you find all of the journalists under 40 some under 30, and this is where you find all of the digital journalists. Now, the problem is that they're marketers and they're trying to market products and content. So a lot of this stuff they're doing, a lot of this stuff they're not doing, but that's where they are. And you can find that organization in the chat. Thank you, Richard, and thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you, Todd. Melvin Claxton.
Thank you, Richard. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, great. This was a phenomenal conversation, and thank you for inviting me. I am a former national investigative reporter with the Chicago Tribune and the Detroit News, originally from Antigua in the Caribbean, and I've covered much of South America and the Caribbean over the years. And there's a point I think I really want to make, and I'll just leave the floor for someone else. One of the problems with the US media in covering foreign countries is that it goes back to the maxim that all news is local. American media outlets cover the news from the American's perspective. You don't care about what's happening in Africa or the Caribbean unless it impacts America. How does it impact American business? How are American lives impacted by it? And that's the coverage you're going to see. And to actually alter that, the African media outlets will have to fill that gap. They will have to tell the African stories. You will never, ever see those stories in the US. We had the same problem in the Caribbean. You know, we tell our stories, and the only interest the US or British media had was, how does this affect, you know, Europe? How does it affect the US? So that's just a point I really want to make, that we have to have indigenous local reporting reflective of those concerns, because you're not going to see it in the American media.
Thank you. I will have to say, though, that looking at the African media's coverage of this conference, it was the same thing. They were concerned about how their country is affected at the trade. It was not global, it wasn't big view. It was, what is my prime minister doing? How is this going to affect me? So that's just part of the business, apparently. Roger Witherspoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. Can you hear me okay now?
I can hear you.
Okay, thanks again. It's good to see you. I'm another old timer, 56 years in the news business, in radio, television, and print. And I'm glad to be here. Take care and happy holidays and stay safe.
Thank you. Zadie Zoku.
Richard, we can't hear you.
Zadie Zoku.
Stay in the middle.
All right. Do you want to introduce yourself again, Zadie?
Oh, yeah. So I'm Zadie Zoku, originally from the Ivory Coast. Now I'm an Ivorian American since a week ago. And I'm a filmmaker, and I make movies. In my movies, I try to connect Africans and African Americans, and I'm making another one right now. I'm going to talk about it later. But what I would like to say right now is, if Richard is okay with that, I can send him a link. I can send him a link to my latest movie, Black and Black, about the relationships between African Americans and African immigrants. Yeah, for a limited time, so he can share it with whoever wants to watch it. So if he's okay with the idea, yeah, this afternoon I'm going to send him the link. All right, that's it.
Thank you, thank you. Benita Bing.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Benita Bing, president of the Exposure Group, African American Photographers Association, located here in Washington, D.C. I'm also the owner of the Talbot and Bing Studios, located in the Brooklyn Northeast section of Washington, D.C., and the producer of the Journalism Roundtable. Thank you.
You're here. All right. Milton Allimadi.
Yes, I'm Milton Allimadi, and I publish Black Star News here in New York City. I also teach as an adjunct professor at John Jay College. I teach African history, and at Columbia, I teach journalism, also as an adjunct. I am also the author of a book that came out last year, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized, in Western media. And it traces 3 centuries of demonization of Africa. And I show the correlationship between the demonization and exploitation through the era of slavery, colonialism, and then neo-colonialism. And I had the fortune actually of going to the archives of the New York Times, and I dug up some decent evidence that proved that in many instances, they even manufactured, quote, tribalistic incidents that never occurred in Africa and inserted it into news articles. So that's why I call the book Manufacturing Hate. And the evidence was in the form of some of their own correspondents sending letters from Africa and demanding to know from their editors who inserted that incident into my article about Nigerians dressed in grass leaf skirts that I never saw and I never wrote about. And not surprisingly, the New York Times, of course, did not review this book, but people can get it
in journalism, so
people can get it. And thank you so much. You were the first to write about it, actually. And then 2 other folks got the courage to write about it after they read your article. So thank you so much for that. People can get it directly from the book publisher.
Okay, thank you. Hazel Trice-Edney.
Hazel Trice-Edney, editor-in-chief of the Trice-Edney Newswire, president and CEO of Trice-Edney Communications. We are celebrating our 12th year this year. I am also an adjunct professor at Howard University School of Communications, teaching multicultural media history and communications entrepreneurship.
Thank you, Hazel. Lynn Adrian.
Lynn Adrian here. I'm one of the board members of the Roundtable. I am now about to retire from my position as the director of the Washington Graduate Capstone Program for the Newhouse School at Syracuse University. I'm also just finishing my 8th round of being a juror for the DuPont Columbia Awards. And I mentioned that because there have been times when we have had journalism and reporting presented for consideration before us and about Africa, especially concerning the Ebola and other situations. And it's always about the pathology of Africa. It's always about what's wrong with Africa, as opposed to anything else about what's going on with any of the specific countries within the continent. And I think we have to be involved with that because these mainstream journalism entities and organizations look at Africa in terms of what's wrong. What's wrong? Not to say that there are not things that are wrong, but we also have to elevate their focus so that we understand that these countries need coverage the way that every other country has.
Thank you, Lynn. Rodney Sieh.
Hi, I'm Rodney Sieh. I'm the former copy editor at the Post-Standard newspaper in Syracuse. Moved to Liberia in 2007 to start the FrontPageAfrica newspaper. I've been to prison twice. The last time I was sentenced to 5,000 years in prison. And my first book is entitled Journalists on Trial. And I have a new book coming out called George Weah, The Story of Africa's Footballer President, due out in March next year, just in time for Liberia elections. So I'll be in DC on April 1st to launch my book at the the gathering spot in DC. And I'll be in London on March 11th to launch also at the, what you call the place? I'm sorry, I'm losing track here.
They'll find out.
I'll be launching at the Birdcage. Okay, so it's going to be a fascinating book. I think I worked for 4 or 5 years on it. So if you want to know about Africa, about Liberia history and all that, about how George Weah became president, the challenges we're going through, that's the book to get next year. I'm glad to be on this platform, on this forum. It's been very engaging. Thanks to Richard. I think it's something that should be encouraged, maybe from quarterly or maybe twice a year. Or, it's unique because Africa is a great continent. It's somewhere where people can, a lot of business ventures going on there, a lot of people doing things that people don't know about. It's sad that our stories are not being told, and we have to tell our own stories. I did some work with an autobiography for Netflix that was supposed to come out a couple of years now. It hasn't come out, about the first female president in Africa. I think they're having a problem raising money. It just tells you some of the things that happen in Africa in terms of how people see Africa. A great story, a great woman's story is being told, but it can't get, I don't think it get funded. So these things happen. A lot of media are having problems with funding. And I think that plays a role in the coverage of Africa because people don't want to spend money covering Africa. They feel that Africa is not important. When I started my second book, they told me no Western publisher will carry it because it's Africa. So I still managed to get it published. It's coming out next year. So I'm very excited about it.
All right, thank you, Rodney, and good luck with that. Yannick Rice-Lamb.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yannick Rice-Lamb. I'm a professor in the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film at Howard University. I want to thank Richard for this program and also for attending the final capstone presentations of our graduating seniors for them and inviting them to Journal-isms today. Some of them had to leave, but they really enjoyed the program. But I'd also like to introduce you to Kendall Lanier. Journalism is in good hands with students like her. She's in the broadcast journalism version, and I'll let her introduce herself to you now.
Okay, Kendall.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kendall Lanier, senior journalism major, sports administration minor at Howard University. I'm also president of the Howard University Association of Black Journalists chapter, and I'm looking forward to going into a career in broadcast journalism and appreciate you all for inviting me to this conversation. And I know another one of my classmates is here, Iana Fenton.
I think Iana just left, but Kendall was also co-anchor of our News Vision newscast as well.
Ah, very good. Is Kiratiana Freelon still here? She said she had to leave. I wanted to be sure people knew about her because she is the co-chair of the NABJ Global Journalism Task Force. And since NABJ came up in the conversation as to what they can do, people need to know that she is here and was listening, and you can contact her if you have, if you have things to say about what NABJ can be doing about some of the issues we've raised here.
Richard, Iana is still here. Can I introduce her quickly?
Oh, yes, please.
Okay, Iana Fenton also is one of our broadcast journalists. Iana, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi, my name is Iana Fenton. I am a recent graduate of Howard University. I majored in journalism with a minor in psychology, and I was the director for our News Vision newscast this semester.
Thank you. Now, you heard what was said about how we need to get more people of your generation involved in these things. So I hope you'll, words to the wise. Okay. Darren Snyder. Unmute.
Yes. I was unmuting as you spoke. Thank you for having me, Richard. Thanks for putting this together. Always a great conversation on journalism. My name is Darren Snyder. I'm 35 plus years in journalism, primarily in sports, but not exclusively. One of the greatest highlights of my career, even though I didn't write anything, was accompanying a group of journalists to Africa when President Clinton visited there. And spent several days over there, and we were all Black journalists, and we were welcomed, and the natives, Africans over there, they told us they considered us their long lost cousins. So I did feel a bonding, and I felt like that's something that definitely needs to be amplified. Also want to give a shout out to Kendall. Kendall was the moderator for a discussion after the screening of Kaepernick in America, a documentary that was screened at Howard University last month, and she did an excellent job. And also want to say, Milton, your book, I was listening to some podcasts, and they were talking about this New York Times correspondence between the writer and the editor. And like you said, he was saying, like, y'all are making stuff up, and the Times would not even acknowledge that they did that. And that's infuriating. We should still hold their feet to the fire over that. And thanks again, everybody.
What countries were you in Africa?
I was just in Ghana.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Wanted to know that. All right, Lisa Tinsley, first timer.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Happy Sunday to y'all. Glad to be here. I am the founder and program director of KISA Public Radio. We're an online African-American news and cultural radio station, highlighting stories about our community here in the States, but also Africa. So I have about 3 pages of notes of stories to write on. So thank you for this discussion today. And I look forward to seeing you all again next year. Happy holidays.
Very good. Glad you made it. Elliot Francis.
Thank you, Richard. I am Elliot Francis, former news anchor, reporter for about 45 years in television. Currently the host and producer of Now with Elliot Francis, live streamed over YouTube and Facebook each week. Fascinating discussion once again. Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you, everybody, for chiming in, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Sharon Farmer.
People, I'm from Southeast DC. Now, that African trip that he's talking about, I was on. I'm sorry he didn't go to all the countries. They always hold us back from doing our thing, and it makes me mad. So I look forward whenever the revolution comes, even if I'm dead. I hope I walk out the grave. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Deborah Berry.
Hi, I'm Deborah Berry. I'm a national correspondent for USA Today. I'm on an enterprise team. And in fact, it was USA Today that sent me to Angola a couple of years ago to work on a project. But I am now on leave because I'm a Neiman Fellow. So I'm home on college break and joining the conversation. So thank you very much, Richard.
Here, thank you. Robin Washington.
Hello, I am one of those young journalists you're looking for. Just 45 years in the business, not 50 like Joe and all. You can. My current gigs that are interfering with my retirement are Wisconsin Public Radio, American City Business Journals, and the Forward, as in formerly the Yiddish Daily Forward, of which I am editor at large, and for which I will give a small victory along these lines right now, which is, I hate to bring up the word, Kanye and Kyrie. Because of their discussions and everything, people have been asking, well, who are the Hebrew Israelites and what do they believe? And are they really saying that Black people were the original Jews? And that's anti-Semitic. Timeout. It is not, okay? It is anti-Semitic if you say Black people were the original Jews, or they were Jews in Africa in antiquity, and therefore white Jews are not valid. Okay, don't cancel anybody else out. But in fact, the first part, to say that there were Black Jews in Africa in antiquity, is a fact. And I've been pushing that in the paper, and it is beginning to take hold. So, you know, this is a victory. It is changing the narratives that we're talking. It's changing. It's bringing the narrative that always should have been there. So, yeah. So thank you. Thank you very much, Richard, panelists, and all of you.
All right, John Watson.
Hi, I'm John Watson, a professor of journalism at American University, focusing on journalism ethics and communication law. Good discussion, glad to be a part of it.
Very good, thank you, John. Ron Howell. Unmute.
Yes, that's necessary, isn't it? Yeah. No, I was saying wonderful job, and thank you again. Yes, I'm Ron Howell, retired of a professor of journalism in the English department at Brooklyn College. But in the last, 3 years, I've published 2 books with Fordham University Press, one on the history of Black politics in Brooklyn, and the other about Al Sharpton, called King Al. And you know, it was because of that that I took special note of Joe Davidson's article about the visit of the African heads of state last week, because his piece noted how angry to a person they were with Greg Meeks, the congressman from Queens, New York, at legislation he introduced that essentially would punish African states that seem to be cooperating with Russia in taking what the United States considered to be positions against principles of that the United States says it acknowledges. I thought that that was so interesting, and I wondered whether also maybe some of the African heads of state or anyone else who agrees with them, identifies with them on that topic, would reach out to Al Sharpton, who has been so close and influential with Gregory Meeks. And I just found that very, very interesting. And also I wanted actually to hear more about the reaction to Gregory Meeks. I mean, he's a powerful legislator, and to have that kind of anger at him, it just seems to me it should be getting attention on the national scene and maybe locally here in New York City, where he's from.
All right. Brenda Wilson.
Sorry, I actually have a young Black journalist who just stepped into my house who's visiting me now. And I want to thank Mel, who helped me out. She was trying to look to cover some of the leaders who were in town last week. But that's one thing you can all do. You can sort of mentor young journalists. I don't consider myself the greatest mentor, but if somebody wants help, I never reject it or never deny them any assistance I can give them. I worked at NPR for 30 years, part of that time at the White House as a general assignment reporter, as a feature reporter, and spent 10 years covering global health. A lot of that throughout all of Africa, many places in Africa, Ethiopia, South Africa, Nigeria, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Senegal, you know, throughout the continent, primarily though in Nigeria and South Africa. And I guess the one thing I always told journalists who came to me and asked for advice when they were going is don't make any presumptions at all. Try to keep as open a mind as possible. Do not presume anything. Do not presume that people won't be friendly. Do not presume they will be friendly. Take whatever comes, adjust, adapt, just go along, go with the flow. You know, don't make any assumptions. Just go with as open a mind as you can. Don't think you already know before you get there. It's sort of like by the time you get there, you'll find out how much you don't know after a period of time. So that's my take on things. And thank you. Good to listen to you. Good to hear you. I hope these discussions will continue.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you. Let's see. I think somebody's been, oh, Lynn Washington. Lynn, are you there?
Let me unmute.
Thank you.
And on video. Hi, Richard. Fascinating session.
I'm surprised you didn't say anything.
It's so important to, you know, keep these kind of discussions going. There was a session in Marrakesh in 2009, the Afro Cities conference, of the 150 not presenters, but you know, where they have the corporations and things like that, only 3 from America. 2 very important sessions took place there. One, the role of China in Africa and how they were, you know, what they were doing, and, you know, positive and negative. And then the other was the coverage of Africa in Western media. And it was just fascinating to hear the African journalists then say things very similar to what we heard today. And I would just like to close with a little reminder about Freedom's Journal, the first African-American owned newspaper in the country. In their opening editorial, they declared that everything about Africa would have ready admission to their pages. And if we follow that directive today, we would make a big step. So thanks a lot, Richard. It's an incredible session, and compliments to you and everybody who participated in it.
Thanks. Tell everybody where you teach.
Oh, I teach at Temple University. I'm in the Department of Journalism, and we have a program where we take students into South Africa, and I mean like into the townships, you know, Alec, Orange Farm, and they do journalism, and it's, you know, to enhance their ability to do international reporting, but also their sensitivities in seeing the parallels between the deep-seated racism there and its effect on the current society and what we have here.
Exactly. Very good. Gloria Minot.
Hi, I'm Gloria Minot, formerly of WHUR and WPFW Radio. Richard, you have outdone yourself again. Thank you for having this session. I've learned so much. And I just want to say before I go that let's not forget Paul Rusesabagina in Rwanda. I read something recently where he's not doing well at all. Whatever we can do to keep his name in the news, please let us do that. Once again, Richard, thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. All right, did I leave anybody out? No, good, okay. All right, well, thank everybody for coming and participating, and there was so much to write about, so many points that were made. So we thank you for that, and I hope the people on Facebook have comments as well. We're going to print out the chat room and distribute it to everybody who was on the call, so that you can have all the links and connections that people mentioned, as well as their comments. So I thank you, and meantime, happy holidays, and happy Hanukkah, which starts tonight for those who observe that holiday. And we will see you in January. Thanks again.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you all.